How do you expose a gold digger? I was sitting in my apartment Friday evening when my older brother Camden called, asking if I'd met his new girlfriend yet. We'd always been close despite the 3-year age gap, and he sounded happier than I'd heard him in months after his brutal divorce from his high school sweetheart. He'd just gotten promoted to senior architect at his firm, finally making the kind of money our parents always said he deserved after years of grinding through terrible projects. The divorce settlement had been fair, but expensive, and I knew he'd been lonely in that big house he bought right before everything fell apart. Now he was telling me about this woman named Sloane who worked at an art gallery downtown, describing how sophisticated and cultured she was, how she appreciated fine things but wasn't materialistic. The way he talked about her made me want to meet this person who'd brought light back into his life after watching him struggle through 18 months of legal battles and depression. We made plans for dinner Sunday at this upscale Italian place Camden suggested, one of those restaurants where entrees start at $40 and the wine list has pages dedicated to regions I couldn't pronounce. I showed up in khakis and a button-down, feeling underdressed the moment I walked through the door and saw white tablecloths and crystal stemware at every table. Camden was already seated with a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her dark hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, and her makeup was flawless in that way that seems effortless, but definitely isn't. She stood to greet me with a smile that showed impossibly white teeth, extending a hand with manicured nails painted a subtle rose color. Her handshake was firm but brief, and I noticed the designer watch on her wrist catching the restaurant lighting as she sat back down. Camden introduced her as Sloane Whitley, and she immediately launched into questions about my work as a high school guidance counselor, seeming genuinely interested in hearing about my students and their college application struggles. The evening progressed smoothly with Sloane asking thoughtful questions and sharing stories about her job at the Meridian Gallery, where she claimed to work as an assistant curator specializing in contemporary sculpture. She talked knowledgeably about artists I'd never heard of, describing exhibitions she'd helped organize and collectors she'd worked with over the years. Camden hung on her every word, his hand finding hers on the table between courses, and I felt genuinely happy seeing him smile like that again. When the check came, Sloane made a show of reaching for her purse, but Camden waved her off and pulled out his credit card without hesitation. She thanked him sweetly and kissed his cheek, then excused herself to the restroom while we waited for the server to return. As soon as she was out of earshot, Camden leaned across the table and asked what I thought, his eyes bright with hope and maybe a little anxiety about my opinion. I told him she seemed great, that I was happy he'd found someone who made him smile again, and I meant it because I had no reason to think otherwise at that point. The next few weeks brought more dinners and group outings where Sloane integrated herself into our family circle with impressive efficiency. She showed up to our parents' anniversary party with an expensive bottle of wine and a beautiful arrangement of flowers, complimenting our mother's cooking and asking about family photos on the mantel. My younger sister Ivy took to her immediately, bonding over fashion and music, while our parents seemed charmed by her polished manners and cultured references. Sloane always looked immaculate at these gatherings, wearing outfits that coordinated perfectly with each venue, her accessories always tasteful and clearly expensive. I noticed she never drove herself anywhere, always arriving with Camden in his new Audi, and she'd mentioned casually that her car was in the shop or she'd had trouble with the parking. Small things that didn't register as concerning at the time, just minor inconveniences that seemed plausible enough. 3 months into their relationship, Camden mentioned over coffee that he was thinking about asking Sloane to move in with him. His house had 4 bedrooms, and he'd been rattling around alone in all that space since the divorce, so having someone there made sense to him. I asked if things were getting serious, and he admitted they'd already talked about long-term plans, maybe engagement by the end of the year if everything continued going well. The timeline felt fast to me given his recent divorce, but I didn't want to rain on his happiness after watching him struggle for so long. He described how Sloane had been staying over most nights anyway, keeping clothes in his closet and toiletries in his bathroom, so formalizing the arrangement seemed like a natural next step. When I asked about her lease and how that would work, he waved it off saying she was month to month at her current place and could leave any time without penalty. The first crack in Sloane's perfect facade appeared during a family barbecue at my parents' house in late spring. I was helping my dad at the grill when I overheard Sloane talking to Ivy about a recent shopping trip to the designer outlets an hour north of the city. She was describing the incredible deals she'd found, mentioning specific brands and price points that made my sister's eyes widen with envy. But something about the way she described the layout of the outlets didn't match my memory of visiting that same location with friends last year. Small details were wrong, like she mentioned stores that didn't exist there, and described a food court that I remembered being on the opposite end from where she placed it. I filed the observation away as maybe just confusion or misremembering, not significant enough to mention, but odd enough to notice. Later that same afternoon, I was helping clear plates when I found Sloane in the kitchen looking through mail our mother had left on the counter. She quickly set down the envelope she'd been examining when she noticed me, laughing about being nosy and looking for the trash can to throw away her napkin. The envelope she'd been holding was from my dad's investment firm, and I wondered why she'd been so interested in his financial mail. Camden's birthday arrived in June, and Sloan organized an elaborate surprise party at an expensive downtown restaurant, inviting his college friends and work colleagues to a private room she'd reserved weeks in advance. The whole evening must have cost thousands between the venue fee, open bar, and catered dinner, and when I asked Camden later who'd paid for everything, he admitted he'd covered it, but Sloan had done all the planning and coordination. She'd convinced him the surprise was that she'd organized it, not that she'd paid for it, and he'd been happy to fund the celebration because she'd put so much effort into making his day special. The logic made sense on the surface but felt manipulative in a way I couldn't quite articulate. A truly generous gesture would have been organizing something within her own budget, or at least splitting the cost, not planning an extravagant party she expected him to finance. I mentioned this concern to Ivy afterward, and she defended Sloan, saying she'd put in hours of work coordinating everything, and that was its own kind of contribution. My sister had a point, but the whole situation still bothered me in ways I struggled to explain. Summer brought more observations that accumulated like drops filling a bucket. Sloan's stories about her job became vaguer when pressed for specifics, mentioning projects and exhibitions without providing concrete details about timelines or her actual responsibilities. When I casually mentioned wanting to visit the Meridian Gallery to see her work, she quickly explained that her role was mostly behind the scenes and she rarely interacted with visitors. Camden mentioned she'd been working irregular hours lately, sometimes leaving early in the morning and returning late at night, but he attributed it to a major exhibition they were preparing. I decided to do some basic research and pulled up the Meridian Gallery website, scrolling through their staff directory and upcoming exhibition calendar. Sloan's name didn't appear anywhere on the site, not in the curatorial staff list, or in any credits for past or upcoming shows. I searched her full name plus the gallery name and found nothing beyond their general contact information. The absence of any digital footprint for someone claiming to work there for years seemed strange in an age where every organization maintains detailed online presence. I called the gallery directly the next day, asking to speak with Sloan Whitley in the curatorial department. The receptionist put me on hold for a long moment before returning to say they had no one by that name on staff. When I described her and mentioned contemporary sculpture, the receptionist suggested I might be thinking of someone else, or perhaps she worked at a different gallery in the city. I thanked her and hung up, staring at my phone while trying to decide what this information meant. Either Sloan had lied about where she worked, or she'd been let go and was maintaining the fiction, or she'd never worked there at all. None of these options were good, and I knew I needed to talk to Camden before making accusations that could damage our relationship. That evening I drove to his house unannounced, finding him alone working on architectural drawings at his dining room table. Sloan was supposedly at a gallery event that would run late, which gave me an opportunity to speak privately. I showed Camden the gallery website and explained about the phone call, watching his face cycle through confusion, denial, and finally a defensive anger that surprised me. He insisted there must be a mistake, that maybe she worked as a contractor or consultant rather than full staff, or perhaps she'd asked them not to list her publicly for privacy reasons. His explanations grew increasingly elaborate as he tried to rationalize information that contradicted what Sloan had told him. When I suggested he simply ask her directly about the discrepancy, he accused me of trying to sabotage his relationship because I was jealous of his happiness or couldn't handle him moving on from his marriage. The words stung because they were completely unfair, but I understood he was reacting from a place of fear that this new relationship might be built on lies. We argued for another 20 minutes before I left, feeling like I'd made everything worse instead of better. Camden didn't speak to me for the next week, ignoring my calls and responding to texts with short, cold replies that made it clear he wasn't ready to hear anything negative about Sloan. Ivy called me the following Saturday asking why Camden was upset with me, saying he'd mentioned we'd had a fight but wouldn't explain the details. I debated how much to share before deciding she deserved to know what I'd discovered, so I explained about the gallery and the phone call. My sister went quiet for a long moment before admitting she'd also noticed some inconsistencies in Sloan's stories, small things that hadn't seemed important individually but formed a pattern when considered together. She mentioned how Sloan always had reasons why she couldn't pick up checks at restaurants or contribute to group gifts, usually blaming frozen accounts or delayed payments from her gallery sales. Ivy had started keeping a mental tally of excuses and realized Sloan had never actually paid for anything substantial in the months they'd known her. Every dinner, every event, every shopping trip somehow ended with Camden or someone else covering her expenses. My sister suggested we do more digging before confronting Camden again, gathering enough evidence that he couldn't dismiss our concerns as jealousy or misunderstanding. We started with basic social media searches, finding Sloan's Instagram account filled with carefully curated photos of luxury experiences and designer possessions. Her captions mentioned exotic vacations and exclusive events, always tagged at expensive locations, but never showing the faces of whoever she was with. Scrolling back through 2 years of posts revealed a pattern of her posing with different luxury cars, designer handbags, and 5-star hotels, each photo implying wealth and status without explicitly claiming ownership. Comments from friends congratulated her on purchases and experiences, but something felt staged about the whole presentation, like she was manufacturing an aspirational lifestyle. Ivy noticed that many photos were taken at the same locations months apart, but posted as if they were current, reusing content to maintain an illusion of constant luxury. We found older photos from 3 years ago showing a completely different aesthetic, more modest locations and accessible brands, before her content shifted dramatically to the high-end lifestyle she currently portrayed. I decided to visit the Meridian Gallery in person, wanting to see the space and maybe learn more about Sloane's supposed connection to the institution. The gallery occupied a converted warehouse in the Arts District, all exposed brick and polished concrete floors, with massive contemporary sculptures dominating the main exhibition space. I wandered through the current show, reading wall text and watching staff members interact with visitors, none of them resembling Sloane. At the front desk, I struck up a conversation with the young woman working reception, mentioning I was interested in the curatorial program and asking about internship opportunities. She pulled out information packets and started explaining their structure, mentioning the names of their 3 curators and the assistant positions below them. When I casually dropped Sloane's name, asking if she'd be someone I could shadow, the receptionist looked genuinely confused and said she'd been working there for 2 years and never heard that name. She pulled up their internal directory on her computer, searching thoroughly before confirming no one named Sloane Whitley had ever been employed by the gallery in any capacity. Armed with this information, Ivy and I planned our next move carefully. We needed to present Camden with facts he couldn't dispute, documentation that would force him to see what Sloane was hiding. My sister suggested we hire a private investigator, but that felt too extreme and expensive for information we might be able to gather ourselves. Instead, we divided research tasks and spent the next week digging into every claim Sloane had made about her background. She'd mentioned growing up in Connecticut and attending an expensive private university, so we searched alumni databases and found no record of anyone matching her name and graduation year. Her supposed master's degree in art history from a prestigious program couldn't be verified through their public records. Every verifiable claim about her education and work history led to dead ends, like she'd constructed an entirely fictional biography. The breakthrough came when Ivy discovered a news article from 5 years ago about a woman named Sloane Whitley, arrested for credit card fraud in a neighboring state. The photo showed someone who looked remarkably similar to Camden's girlfriend, though the article mentioned she'd used multiple aliases and false identities. The charges had been reduced to misdemeanors with probation, but the pattern of behavior described targeting wealthy divorced men and accumulating debt in their names before disappearing. I felt sick reading the details because they aligned perfectly with what we'd observed over the past months. Ivy and I spent hours debating whether this was definitely the same person or just someone with the same name, but the photo similarity and behavior patterns were too coincidental to ignore. We needed to show this to Camden before Sloane could do serious damage to his finances or credit. Sunday morning, I drove to Camden's house without calling first, knowing he'd refuse to see me if I gave him advance warning. His car was in the driveway, but Sloane's supposed vehicle that was always in the shop was nowhere to be seen, which made sense because it probably never existed. I knocked repeatedly until Camden answered, looking annoyed and tired, asking what was so important that I had to show up unannounced. I told him we needed to talk immediately about Sloane, that I had information he needed to see before making any permanent decisions about their future. He tried to close the door, but I stuck my foot in the gap, holding up my phone showing the news article about the fraud arrest. His face went pale as he stared at the photo, and I watched him cycle through denial, recognition, and horror as the implications sank in. He let me inside, and we sat at his kitchen table while I showed him everything Ivy and I had compiled over the past 2 weeks. Camden's hand shook as he scrolled through the documentation, reading the gallery's confirmation that Sloane had never worked there and seeing the lack of verification for any aspect of her supposed background. When he got to the arrest article, he put his head in his hands and just sat there breathing heavily while I waited for him to process everything. Finally, he looked up and told me Sloane had access to his credit cards and bank accounts, that he'd added her as an authorized user shortly after she moved in because it seemed easier for household expenses. He'd noticed some charges he didn't recognize over the past month, but Sloane had explained them as things she bought for the house or gifts for family members. Now he was wondering how much money had already disappeared and whether his credit had been compromised. I suggested he check his accounts immediately, but he seemed paralyzed by the betrayal, unable to move or make decisions. I pulled out my laptop and helped Camden log into his banking portal, both of us shocked by what we found in his transaction history. Over the past 3 months, more than $40,000 had been charged to his credit cards for purchases he hadn't made or authorized. Designer clothing, jewelry, luxury hotel stays in cities Camden had never visited, cash advances from ATMs across the region. Sloane had been systematically draining his accounts while maintaining her facade of the sophisticated girlfriend who never asked for money. She'd been strategic about it, spreading charges across multiple cards and timing them to avoid triggering fraud alerts. Camden's face went from shock to fury as we documented each suspicious transaction, printing statements and highlighting purchases he definitely hadn't made. I asked where Sloane was right now, and he said she'd left early that morning claiming she needed to visit her sick mother upstate, though given everything else we'd learned, that was probably another lie. We spent the next hour calling Camden's credit card companies to report fraud and freeze his accounts, explaining that an authorized user had been making unauthorized charges. The customer service representatives walked him through dispute processes and advised filing police reports to document the theft. Camden's voice cracked when he had to admit his girlfriend had been stealing from him, the humiliation evident in how he struggled to explain the situation. After securing his finances, we called my parents and asked them to check their own accounts and credit cards, worried that Sloan might have accessed their information during her visits to their house. My mother answered, sounding confused by the request, until I explained what we'd discovered, and I heard her sharp intake of breath as she realized the woman she'd welcomed into our family had been running a con the entire time. My father confirmed within minutes that someone had applied for a credit card in his name using his social security number and our parents' home address, though the application had been denied due to a credit freeze he maintained after a data breach years ago. The attempted fraud had happened just 2 weeks after Sloan had been looking at mail on their kitchen counter, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. She'd been gathering information on my entire family, probably planning to expand her operation beyond just Camden's resources. I felt a cold rage building as I realized how calculating and predatory her behavior had been, targeting not just my brother, but potentially all of us. Camden sat at the table looking destroyed, processing that someone he'd trusted and cared for had viewed him purely as a mark to exploit. We filed police reports that afternoon, Camden providing documentation of the fraudulent charges, and Ivy contributing the news article about Sloan's previous arrest. The officer taking our statements explained that financial exploitation cases like this were increasingly common, with sophisticated con artists targeting people through dating apps and social situations. He said the previous arrest record would help establish a pattern of behavior, though he warned that recovering the money would be difficult, even if they managed to locate and arrest Sloan. She'd likely already spent or moved the funds, and restitution through the courts could take years, if it happened at all. Camden asked what he should do when Sloan returned to the house, and the officer advised not confronting her alone, suggesting he change the locks immediately and move any valuables to secure locations. Camden and I spent the rest of Sunday changing locks on his house and checking for any property Sloan might have taken during her months living there. We discovered his grandmother's jewelry was missing from a box in his bedroom closet, pieces he'd been saving to possibly give to a future wife that were now gone along with their sentimental value. Several expensive watches had vanished from his dresser drawer, and a coin collection he'd inherited from our grandfather was nowhere to be found. Each missing item felt like another violation, proof that Sloan had been methodically stealing from him while he slept beside her at night. We documented everything for the police report, and Camden took photos of empty jewelry boxes and spots where items used to be displayed. His house felt contaminated somehow, like every surface Sloan had touched now carried the taint of her deception. Monday morning brought a call from a detective assigned to Camden's case, asking him to come to the station to provide additional statements. The detective explained they'd run Sloan's information through their database and discovered she was currently wanted on an outstanding warrant from another county for similar fraud charges. Her real name was apparently Sloan Whitley, but she'd used variations and aliases across multiple jurisdictions, making it difficult to track her criminal history. The detective showed Camden booking photos from previous arrests, and he had to confirm that yes, this was definitely the woman who'd been living in his house and stealing from him for months. They asked if he had any idea where she might have gone, and he admitted he had no clue, that everything she'd told him about her life had been lies. The detective assured him they'd issue a warrant for her arrest and work with other jurisdictions where she'd committed similar crimes. Sloan never returned to Camden's house after that Sunday morning, seemingly aware that her con had been exposed. She'd left behind clothes and toiletries but taken anything of value she could carry, disappearing as thoroughly as she'd originally appeared. Camden checked security footage from his doorbell camera and saw her leaving early Sunday morning with 2 large suitcases, walking to a car parked down the street that must have belonged to whoever was helping her or her next victim. She'd known somehow that her time was up, possibly tipped off by someone monitoring Camden's account activity who noticed him freezing cards and reporting fraud. The detective said con artists like Sloan often had networks of accomplices who helped them move between targets and locations, making them difficult to catch and prosecute. The following weeks were brutal for Camden as he dealt with the aftermath of Sloan's betrayal. He had to notify his employer about the situation because some fraudulent charges had been made using his corporate credit card that she must have photographed or stolen information from. His credit score dropped significantly from the debt she'd accumulated and the disputed charges showing up across multiple accounts. Insurance covered some losses but not others, and he faced months of paperwork fighting with credit card companies and collections agencies. The emotional toll was worse than the financial damage, watching my brother struggle with feelings of humiliation and stupidity for not seeing through Sloan's facade earlier. He blamed himself for being blinded by loneliness and the desire to move on from his divorce, questioning every instinct and decision that had led him to trust her. Our family rallied around Camden, but the experience had shaken everyone's faith in their own judgment. My parents felt guilty for welcoming Sloane so warmly without asking harder questions about her background. Ivy was angry at herself for defending Sloane when I'd first raised concerns, recognizing now that she'd been manipulated along with everyone else. I struggled with my own guilt about not pushing harder or investigating sooner, wondering if I could have prevented some of the damage if I'd trusted my initial instincts. The whole situation taught us painful lessons about how skilled con artists exploit normal human desires for connection and belonging, using our own good faith against us. 3 months after Sloane disappeared, the detective called to inform us she'd been arrested in a different state under a different name, running the same scam on another divorced man she'd met through a dating app. The new victim had gotten suspicious faster than Camden and contacted police before she could steal as much, leading to her arrest when she tried to use a fraudulent credit card. She was now facing multiple felony charges across several jurisdictions, and the detective said Camden would likely need to testify if any of the cases went to trial. He dreaded the prospect of seeing her again, but understood it was necessary for justice. The detective mentioned that investigators had found evidence suggesting Sloane had been running variations of this con for over a decade, targeting dozens of men and accumulating hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen money and property. Camden eventually recovered most of his financial losses through insurance claims and credit card fraud protections, though the process took nearly a year and countless hours of paperwork and phone calls. His credit score slowly improved as fraudulent accounts were removed and legitimate debts were paid down. The emotional recovery took longer, requiring therapy sessions and patient support from family and friends who reminded him that being victimized by a skilled predator didn't reflect poorly on his character or judgment. He eventually started dating again, but approached new relationships with more caution, taking time to verify basic facts and maintaining better boundaries around his finances. The experience had fundamentally changed how he trusted people, leaving scars that would probably never fully heal. Sloane pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges as part of a plea agreement, receiving a 5-year prison sentence with requirements to pay restitution to her victims. Camden attended the sentencing hearing and gave a victim impact statement describing how her actions had devastated his life and eroded his ability to trust others. Sloane stood emotionless while victims spoke, offering no apology or explanation for her years of predatory behavior. The judge called her actions calculating and cruel before imposing the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. Watching her be led away in handcuffs provided some closure for Camden, though it couldn't undo the damage she'd caused or return the time and money she'd stolen. The restitution payments started arriving in small amounts, barely making a dent in what Sloane had taken, but representing some acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. Camden donated most of the money to organizations that helped fraud victims and educated people about financial exploitation, wanting something positive to come from his terrible experience. He spoke at community events about recognizing red flags in relationships and protecting personal financial information, turning his victimization into a tool for helping others avoid similar situations. His willingness to share his story publicly, despite the embarrassment, demonstrated real courage and helped break down the shame that often keeps victims silent. 2 years after meeting Sloane, Camden started dating someone new, a middle school teacher named Flora, who he met through mutual friends. Their relationship developed slowly with clear communication and healthy boundaries, and I watched my brother gradually regain confidence in his ability to judge character. Flora knew about the Sloane situation from early in their relationship because Camden was upfront about his past and the caution he now brought to dating. Rather than being put off by his wariness, she appreciated his honesty and worked with him to build trust gradually. Watching them together reminded me that bad experiences don't have to define us forever, that healing is possible even after significant betrayal. The whole experience taught our family important lessons about verification and healthy skepticism in relationships. We learned that real love and connection shouldn't require blind faith or ignoring red flags, that asking questions and expecting transparency isn't cynical, but necessary. My parents started being more cautious about sharing personal information and securing financial documents, even around people they considered family. Ivy became more alert to manipulation tactics and inconsistencies in people's stories, trusting her instincts when something felt wrong. I learned that protecting the people you love sometimes means having difficult conversations and risking temporary conflict to prevent larger harm. Camden eventually sold the house where he'd lived with Sloane, unable to shake the feeling of violation that lingered in every room she'd occupied. He bought a smaller place closer to downtown, starting fresh in a space untainted by memories of her deception. The new house became a gathering place for family dinners and game nights, slowly filling with positive experiences that crowded out the darkness of those months with Sloane. He kept a photo from the sentencing hearing in his desk drawer as a reminder that he'd survived and rebuilt, proof that predators can be held accountable even if justice takes time. Looking back, the signs had been there from the beginning if we'd known what to look for. The vague job details, the missing digital footprint, the constant financial excuses, the too-perfect presentation, all red flags that seemed minor individually, but formed a clear pattern when viewed together. Sloane's skill had been in exploiting normal social dynamics and people's reluctance to seem suspicious or judgmental, using politeness and benefit of the doubt as weapons in her manipulation. She'd counted on Camden's desire to move on from his divorce and his family's willingness to support his happiness, understanding that people in those vulnerable states make easy targets for exploitation. The detective who worked Camden's case told us that financial predators like Sloan rely on shame to keep victims silent, knowing that people who've been conned often blame themselves and avoid reporting crimes that make them look foolish. By sharing his story publicly, Camden disrupted that pattern and potentially prevented Sloan from victimizing others who might recognize her tactics. Several people reached out after hearing him speak, sharing their own experiences with similar con artists and finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone in being deceived. The community of survivors helped Camden see that intelligence and caution aren't foolproof defenses against skilled manipulators who've perfected their craft over years of practice. 3 years later, Camden married Flora in a small ceremony surrounded by people who'd supported him through the darkest period of his life. His toast at the reception mentioned the journey he'd taken to find real love after learning painful lessons about trust and deception. Flora's vows acknowledged his past while focusing on the future they were building together on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The celebration felt like a final closing of the chapter that had begun with meeting Sloan, proof that surviving betrayal doesn't mean losing the capacity for joy and connection. I sometimes wonder how many other Sloans are out there right now, targeting vulnerable people and destroying lives for financial gain. The research I did after Camden's experience revealed that financial exploitation in relationships is far more common than most people realize, with thousands of cases reported annually and likely many more going unreported due to shame or lack of awareness. The con artists evolve their tactics constantly, using social media and dating apps to identify and groom targets with increasing sophistication. Education and awareness are crucial defenses against these predators, helping potential victims recognize warning signs before significant damage occurs. Camden's experience ultimately made our whole family stronger and more resilient, teaching us to value genuine connection over surface-level charm and to trust our instincts when something feels wrong. We learned that protecting ourselves and each other requires vigilance and courage, willingness to ask hard questions and verify claims even when it feels awkward or suspicious. The cost of that education was high, but the lessons it taught probably prevented future victimization and helped us appreciate authentic relationships built on truth rather than manipulation. So yeah, that's how you expose a gold digger. You document everything, you trust your instincts even when people call you paranoid, and you refuse to let shame or embarrassment keep you from seeking the truth. And when you find that truth, you share it loudly enough to protect others from falling for the same lies. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.